I'm an evangelist about open government. I am passionate about the Freedom of Information Act. I am passionate about access to information. You look at this picture and you probably see paper tied up with string. For me, this is like crack. Because documents, government documents, they hold the truth. And the truth always matters, and the truth really does set us free. So come with me on a quick whirlwind of public records and access to information, and I'm going to show you in the next few minutes how public documents can actually bring about wonderful change. And I think by the time I'm done, all of you are going to be as fired up as I am about the public right to know. So how do I get my hands on records? How does this work? There's a set of laws that are called sunshine laws. Sunshine laws are simple and they're beautiful. The idea is let's let the sun shine in on the government. Open up those doors, open up those windows, let the light come in and show the truth. The framers of our Constitution understood this all too well. When they wrote the First Amendment, they didn't include teachers, doctors, or lawyers, but there it is, a free press, because the idea is you're going to have the press on the outside holding those three pillars accountable: the executive branch, the legislative branch, the Supreme Court, and the fourth pillar on the outside is the press. Think about it this way. If you don't know how your money is being spent, if you don't know how decisions are being made, if you don't know who is influencing what, how do you know really what you support or what you oppose? How do you know how to engage in your community? Keep in mind, it's always going to be a fight to find out what the government wants you not to know about. But there are powerful tools for this fight, and for me, my biggest weapon is the Freedom of Information Act, a law that says government records, government information must be public. In 1960, there were 2 countries that had Freedom of Information Acts, Sweden and Finland. In 1966, the United States got one, but in the last 10 years, as a lot of countries have democratized around the world, something exciting has happened. Country after country has adopted a Freedom of Information Act. Today, most people on the planet have the right to know on paper what's happening inside their government. In China, in India, in South Africa here, where it was a hard-fought law. I'm going to talk to you about how a piece of paper can bring real truth and real freedom. These are federally protected wild horses. They're running on federal land. Here's a federal employee whose job it is to round up the horses and take them to be adopted. And here's the horses. The federal employees were taking the horses, as I followed them, through their ID numbers, through their databases of where horses go, and the federal employees were taking the horses to the slaughterhouse, where they were selling them for $800 or $900 each, and pocketing the money themselves. After we brought this to light, after we used documents to make this public, the federal government set up sanctuaries. Piece of paper to the pasture. A few years ago, the federal government tested lunchboxes for lead, and they reported out that they had tested 60 and that none of them had hazardous levels. I asked, could I see those test results? A year later, after using the Freedom of Information Act, I had a box of hundreds of test results. And what I found was that 1 out of every 5 lunchboxes had high levels of lead. Some were 10 times the safe levels. The Consumer Product Safety Commission told me, yes, but children would have to lick the lunchboxes to be exposed to that. Those of us who have children understand, children lick everything. So, after we reported this, the thresholds were lowered for what is considered safe, and the toxic lunchboxes were pulled from the shelves. In Haiti, thanks. It's not the usual response I get to a news article. In Haiti, after the earthquake, I have been doggedly tracking what's becoming of that money. And as recently as a few months ago, again, using public records, was able to show that of the $1.8 billion the United States pledged to help rebuild and build back better, not a single dollar has been spent to build a single permanent home back in Haiti. In Honduras earlier this year, there was a prison fire. 300 men were killed. They were locked in their cells, and they burned to death. Within hours of that fire, we were pulling up records to show and report that most people in this prison had not even been convicted of a crime. And this is a US military recruiter in a federal prison where he was sentenced for raping an enlistee. And I went in and I heard his story and I spoke with his victim. And then I asked the Defense Department, how often does this happen? How often do 20-something recruiters who are in quiet conversation in closed rooms in cars alone with teenage girls, how often does this happen? And what they told me was, in documents, 80 times in the past year, recruiters had been disciplined for sexual misconduct. 80 times in 1 year. As a result of bringing these documents and this information to light, the Defense Department set up new rules so that teenage girls and boys were not being put in vulnerable situations. And recruiters also felt that they could have more safety. This woman is Kathleen Thorne. She's got a newborn, a 2-year-old, a 7-year-old, and her husband, and within weeks of this picture, within 2 weeks, she asked her doctor if he could put her on birth control. If you've had 2 in diapers like I have, you understand this. But within 6 weeks, after her doctor prescribed the patch, which is a form of birth control, she died of blood clots. At the time, the patch was considered the same level of safety as the pill. They had equal amounts of hormones, but if you think about it, when you put a patch on your skin, those hormones go right into your bloodstream, and when you swallow a pill, it has to pass through your gastrointestinal tract first. So I began looking at cases of death associated with the patch versus the pill and found that it was actually 3 times riskier, pressing the FDA to add a black box warning to the patch. I want to explain, the patch is a good form of birth control for the right people, and now prescribers can have a better idea of who it's going to be safe for and who it's not going to be safe for. And in doing this story, I began wondering, what about in Europe, right? What happens with women with a patch in Europe? Well, in Europe, they don't allow it. Not because it's dangerous to women, but because there's no safe way to get rid of it. You've got all these hormones left on this piece of patch, and what do? You flush it down the toilet, those hormones might enter the waterway. You put it in the landfill, those hormones, trace concentrations, can get into the soil. And so in Europe, it wasn't allowed, but in the United States, it is. And this had myself and some colleagues fanning out to water departments around the United States saying, have you tested drinking water for pharmaceuticals? Have you tested drinking water for antibiotics, ibuprofen, hormones, anything like this? And what we found was that public water utilities were indeed testing the water for this. And just about everywhere they tested, they found it. But they hadn't told anybody about this because they said they didn't know how safe or unsafe this was. They don't know the risks. So why tell anybody what's in your own drinking water? We thought we would go ahead and share it. And we looked to the research and found that when you mix those trace concentrations of pharmaceuticals with blood cells, they grow too fast, they take on strange shapes, some shrink. So there are some reasons to think that this may impact humans, especially with chronic exposure, if you think about your drinking water over many years. In the environment, I'm going to have some of you squirming here, it's much more obvious. The male frogs, the male fish, they start to feminize. They move in ways that are more like female fish, and they start creating egg yolk. This prompted Senate hearings, and I sat there watching a senator lambaste somebody in the EPA, and she said, why is it that we had to wait for the Associated Press to tell us what's in our drinking water? But I was thinking, this is how our government is supposed to work. We're all doing our jobs here. I'm on the outside, and I'm holding that branch accountable. I'm not inside helping keep it private, and it's because we have a free press and because we have an open government that I'm able to do this. Jay Leno had a different take. He said when he first found out there were drugs in his drinking water, he was a little worried, but then he had a glass of water with just a little Xanax in it already, and he found himself not worried at all. Around this time, I got a little heady with the whole Freedom of Information Act thing, and I figured if we have 105 countries around the world with laws, let's do something no one has ever done before. Let's ask the same question of all these different governments, and let's collect all their answers and see how well they comply with their laws, push them to comply with their laws, and find out something really important. And the really important thing I wanted to find out was, how has our world changed since September 11th? After the terror attacks, the United States and the United Nations pressed countries around the world to pass anti-terrorism laws. There was no definition in those laws of what a terrorist was, but we were pressing them to adopt them all the same. And so in a single week, reporters fanned out and asked how many people have been arrested and how many convicted as terrorists in the last 10 years, since 9/11. Prior to 9/11, there was about 100 convicted terrorists a year. So we were curious to find out how this might have changed things. Filing Freedom of Information requests, getting access to information in governments, getting the answer to this relatively simple question, how many arrested, how many convicted, who are they, proved to be complicated. In Tokyo, where you see the Central Post Office, it was a matter of mailing a letter. In Liberia, you had to go to an office and get something stamped. In Mexico, it's as easy as logging onto a website. In Costa Rica, you pick up the phone and ask the information commissioner. In the United States, I go to my post office and get a letter certified, stamped, and registered, and I send separate ones to 7 different agencies. And in China, we were told to file a Freedom of Information Act request to learn how to file Freedom of Information Act requests. So we hired an attorney. And then we did battle back and forth with these governments. Jordan was very reluctant to tell us how they were using their laws. Other countries were much more open. Guatemala, Poland, these were the first 2 to come in with answers. The United States took 6 months and is still giving me pieces of the answers. But in the end, we were able to get big round numbers of how many had been arrested and how many convicted. And what we found was astonishing. And what we found was that 120,000 people have been arrested and 35,000 people convicted as terrorists since 9/11 on the world. Does this make us safer? Some of these people were bombers, some of these people were plotters, some of these people wanted nothing more than to harm innocent civilians. Turkey had the most convicted terrorists. In Turkey, if you are Kurdish and you are fighting for Kurdish rights, in any way, shape, or form, you can be convicted as a terrorist. Turkey had 12,000 convicted terrorists, the most of any country in the world. This woman is one of them. She's a mother of 2 who, at a protest, held up a sign that said, Kurdish people should have rights. She couldn't read the sign because she's illiterate, but she was sentenced to 7 years as a terrorist. This had me so worked up, this project, that we created an ongoing website where any of you, and I invite you to, can come suggest what you would like us to request in Greece, in Nepal, in Argentina, here in the United States. And if we like your idea, we'll make the request. And if we get great documents back, we will report on them. This is ongoing. Please work with us on this. But before you start thinking this is all very heady and international, and what does this have to do with us here? Let's go visit Capitola, 5 miles away, our little jewel box of a town. Years ago, using hundreds and hundreds of pages of files from Capitola, we found that they were financially completely underwater. They had defaulted on a $10 million bond. The feds were knocking at their door. They were about to declare bankruptcy, and nobody was talking about this, only the documents. And after we reported this, they actually were pushed to get their financial books back into order. I went to all the high schools and all the colleges in the county, and I said, are you complying with Title IX, the law that requires equal funding for girls and boys? And not a single one was. Now they do. In Watsonville, and I was talking to some of the students about this, at the County Office of Agriculture, any of you can walk in and ask to see pesticide use reports. And that's what I did. And I saw where they were applying pesticides. And I mapped how much, how often, what time, and how close to the schools. And then I went to the schools and said, how many people here have asthma? How many of your kids? How many of your teachers have had cancers? These are indicators, perhaps, of being exposed to carcinogens. And then we explained in a long, clear story using these records that a lot of pesticides were being used very close to schools. And at the end of this, there came upon some wonderful agreements so that the times they were applied, the types they were applying, the buffer zones could be expanded, and the schools were made safer. So, okay. If I don't have you drinking my Kool-Aid about public records yet, I think this one will get you. This woman is standing at a place called Nogunri, South Korea. And she survived a mass shooting inside of this tunnel. Hundreds of people were killed there 50 years before. She hid behind bodies. The people at the other ends of the guns, the people shooting were US soldiers firing on South Koreans, firing on our allies, firing on the people they were there to help, firing on women and children. And the reason for this was because they feared that there were North Koreans infiltrating these large groups of South Korean civilians. So the South Koreans, a small group of survivors for decades, tried to get someone to acknowledge this had happened, tried to get this recognized, and the US government repeatedly said it didn't happen, there were no US troops in the area. And when I heard about this, I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. with a colleague, and we found that US troops were indeed in the area, and we found their battalion, we found their company name, and we also found documents with orders. Fire on civilians, use discretion with women and children. They are written out, the truth, on the documents. We weren't done. We went and found the men, aging veterans, who 50 years after, when I asked them, what happened at this place? What happened at this time? These were men of great conscience. And they spoke out and said, we shot them. We killed them all. We had to do it. The story won a Pulitzer Prize. Well, the president did not apologize. He did express regret, which is a long way toward acknowledging this. And it was indeed acknowledged, and scholarships were set up. For me, this underscored what's so important about having an open government, because those pieces of paper were nothing. They were just pieces of paper in the National Archives until we were able to bring in that sunlight, bring out the documents, and let them speak the truth. And the truth always matters, and as you can see, the truth sets us free. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Oh, okay.
So Martha, I have a quick question for you.
Okay.
So I feel freer and safer because of what you do, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. But if we don't work for the Associated Press, you know, those of us in the room today and in our community, what can we do with this to agitate for justice and a clean environment, all the things that you talked about?
I'm glad you asked me that. I didn't expect this. But I'm constantly pushing my friends, my own kids, like, go look at those school records and tell me how many Hispanic kids are in your AP classes and how many white kids are in there and how that balances in your school. And then take that to the principal and tell the principal, there's something not right here. I don't have a single Hispanic kid in my AP classes, and the school is 25% Hispanic. Or in your community, if you on your neighborhood, go down to the police station and find out how many break-ins have there been on my block? How many times are the patrols coming here? This matters to me. And you can, so this, whatever it is you see that's pestering you, you can do something about it, starting with public records. If you go in and you whine and you complain and you try to bring about change, you're not going to have the power that you do if you have it right here on paper. This many tons of garbage has been hauled out of Pogonip during this cleanup. This matters to me, so let's put our funding in that direction. So it really is a strong way to engage.
So it's not just something that the press can use, it's really something that every ordinary citizen can use.
I think about 10% of all Freedom of Information Act requests in the country are from the media, and most of those are from the Associated Press, actually. Yeah.
Mostly from you, probably.
Yeah, a lot from me, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.